My topic for today is focused on the Bandō-Sammlung in the Staatsbibliothek, but focusing specifically on photographs as a very rich archival source within this collection, and what photographs, how they can be used and engaged with as part of understanding this historical episode. So, by way of introduction, I'd like to start with a photo. A group of men cluster around a collection of crates and parcels in the center of the image. A few meet the gaze of the photographer, but most are busily engaged in sorting through the contents of the packages. The image's composition naturally guides the viewer's attention towards the right of the image, where three men gather around a table, presumably managing and recording the proceedings. At first glance, it is an utterly mundane image until one begins to register the context in which it was taken. The architecture of the building in the background of the image, as well as the five men visible from the building's two doorways, identifies the photo as having been taken in Japan. Upon closer inspection, the figure in the center of the image, whose posture obscures his face, is the gentleman that's bending down, is visibly the only individual wearing a sword. Finally, all the other individuals, the German men, in the foreground of the image have conspicuous pieces of white fabric affixed to their tunics, and the slight variation of the placement of these pieces of fabric suggests that these were a recent addition to the uniform. Given the title of my talk for today, you have likely already deduced that this photo was taken within one of the prisoner of war camps administered in Japan during the First World War. Knowing this, the rest of the image immediately becomes legible. The man, or the men with the real authority in this image, are not the German officers, but rather the Japanese officials in the photo's background. The man with the sword, whose different uniform now becomes obvious, is recognizable as a Japanese officer, and the purpose of the white pieces of fabric also becomes clear as a form of identification. The photo itself is competently framed and shot, but clearly the work of an amateur. We can also safely assume that the photographer in question was German, not Japanese, based on its compositional choices. The Germans exist in the center of the frame as the principal agents of the scene. Establishing the photographer's motivation in photographing this scene, however, is less straightforward. On the one hand, it documents a routine of daily life within the POW camp, to which the prisoners would have ascribed considerable significance. That is the distribution of letters and packages from family and friends in Germany, as well as mailed goods shipped from elsewhere in East Asia. On the other, it helps to visually construct a narrative of the experience of captivity. The prisoners exist in a confined space within the photo, bound between the buildings to the rear and the armed officer in the image's foreground, and yet they are seemingly relaxed and nonchalant, preoccupied with the immediate task of distributing the mail. This image, along with the many other similar photographs taken by German and Austrian prisoners of war in Japan between 1914 and 1920, reflects the ambiguity of this frequently overlooked facet of the First World War. Our assumptions about the nature of the, quote, war to end all wars, the first total war, the, quote, primal catastrophe of the 20th century, predisposes us to expect certain kinds of imagery, none of which include a group of well-fed, clean soldiers cheerfully sorting the mail. Recent scholarship reminding us that the First World War was indeed a global war has expanded scholarly engagement with the conflict's non-European theaters, and yet East Asia remains a sideshow within broader histories of the war and its consequences. Even within the context of the German-Japanese relationship during the 20th century, which is how I came to this topic, this image complicates both the older historiographic narrative that Germany and Japan, by virtue of both being quote-unquote latecomer states, were naturally predisposed towards political radicalization and militarism, as well as the more recent revisionist position that the First World War represented a rupture in relations between the two states. In my ongoing project, I examined the translation, representation, and negotiation of German identity within the POW camps in Japan during the First World War. So this just gives an outline of the project as it's currently organized and envisioned. The fragile connections back to Germany fostered within these camps, both tangible and symbolic, became even more important as the POWs began to suspect that their existence, to say nothing of their personal sacrifice, as in many cases volunteers and then prisoners of war, had been forgotten. Distance, as well as the lack of ongoing military campaigns in East Asia, positioned the POWs in Japan in a fundamentally different relationship to the war and the German state for which they had fought than their counterparts held elsewhere in Western Europe or in the Russian Empire, as did the fact that they were being held in a non-European, non-white empire. My preliminary thesis is that these camps functioned like other sites of internment during the First World War, as sites where German prisoners constructed, through their actions and activities, an evolving simulacrum of German culture, but that the performance of Germanists mobilized within the specific context of the Japanese camps was less a manifestation of political resentment and radicalization than it was an attempt to articulate and anticipate a different way of being German in the world, one compatible with defeat and decolonization. In other words, it is not incidental to the story that these camps were located in Japan, that country's efforts to be recognized as a Western-style great power notwithstanding. Indeed, what we see in examining the photos taken by the POWs is an attempt to recontextualize their subjective identity as Germans, as prisoners of war, as men, in relationship to their observations of Japan and the Japanese. To be clear, I am not claiming to have discovered this topic or these sources. There has been a lot of really fantastic scholarship done on the POW camps by Japanese researchers over the last several decades, as well as some articles in German and English. My reference to the POWs in Japan as forgotten is not intended to dismiss or minimize the contributions of previous scholars, but rather a nod to the POWs' own fears that their status as the quote-unquote heroes of Tsingtao had been overshadowed and forgotten in Europe. On the other hand, I do see my project as making a meaningful contribution to the historiography of modern Germany and the First World War through its conceptual framing and its use of sources. With respect to the former point, I plan to situate the POW camps within a broader history of German global entanglements in the 19th and 20th century, as well as the greater war paradigm put forward in recent research of the First World War. And so here you see some of the recent publications, all in English. I know there's also some very fine work in German, but you only have so much space available, who I see myself as being in conversation with and thinking about the global history of Germany. And then some of the more recent work thinking about the First World War as a global imperial war. As to the latter point, that the question of sources, I am particularly interested in exploring the subjectivity of the POWs through the various materials and artifacts they created, both within the camps and in their subsequent lives. Like many Germans in the 20th century, some of these POWs were amateur photographers who documented and recorded their experiences through the cameras that were quickly becoming more affordable, easier to use, and more ubiquitous. The photos produced within the camps, whether as individual snapshots or as carefully assembled albums, provide insight into how the POWs made sense of their experience in Japan and their ambivalent position as, on the one hand, emissaries of German culture, and on the other, prisoners subject to the authority of the Japanese Empire. During the remainder of my talk today, I will first provide a brief historical overview of the First World War in East Asia and the POW camps in Japan. I will then offer some preliminary observations and impressions on working with the photographs in the Bandō-Sammlung, not just as illustrations accompanying text or visual confirmation of facts established elsewhere, but as attempts to define a sense of selfhood. In this, I am drawing on the work of historians such as Maiken Umbach, who has argued that photographs, quote, can make the greatest contribution, not in clarifying facts, but in exploring mentalities, behaviors, and practices, unquote. Finally, I will conduct a close reading of the 3 photo albums held in the Bandō-Sammlung, assembled by Rudolf Evert. Evert's albums are a useful resource in exploring the effective and emotive nature of amateur photography, not just because of the greater analytical possibilities of photo albums as compared to individual photos. Evert's choice to create multiple overlapping narratives through his albums reflect his own conflicted feelings towards his experience as a POW, but also symbolize the ambiguity of this historical episode more broadly, wherein German soldiers and sailors were forced to accommodate themselves to a new geopolitical status in the Pacific and globally. Although German scholars, sailors, and scientists have been a consistent presence in the Pacific region for much of the so-called European Age of Discovery, the German Empire's tenure as a colonial power in Asia was a brief one. Germany acquired the Kiautschou Bay lease territory in northeast China in 1898, with the administrative center established at Tsingtao or Qingdao. It purchased its holdings in Micronesia, which included the Caroline and Marianas Islands, as well as Palau, from Spain the following year, following that country's defeat in the Spanish-American War. Germany's territorial expansion in the Asian-Pacific region, pursued as part of the Wilhelmine Empire's policy of Weltpolitik, positioned it as a regional competitor for markets and resources alongside established great powers like Russia and Britain, but also the quickly expanding American and Japanese empires. Japan, its tenuous position in the eyes of its peers as a non-white empire notwithstanding, proved to be a particularly adept student of great power geopolitics. Through a series of successful military campaigns, first against China and then Russia, by 1914, Japan had consolidated its control over the Ryukyu Islands, Taiwan, Korea, and southern Sakhalin. Imperial logic dictated, however, an ongoing pursuit of new opportunities for expansion, and the First World War provided an ideal pretext for Japan, allied with Britain since 1902, to leverage the conflict into some comparatively cheap colonial acquisitions at Germany's expense. Accordingly, on April 23rd, Japan declared war on Germany after a previous ultimatum went insufficiently answered. Japan's Imperial Navy was tasked with neutralizing the German East Asian Squadron, but once it became clear that there would be little German resistance, it moved quickly to consolidate Japanese occupation of German Micronesia. Concurrently, the 18th Infantry Division of the Japanese Imperial Army, supported by a Japanese naval blockade, as well as a symbolic contingent of around 1,500 British colonial troops, initiated a siege of the German port of Tsingtao on August 27th. The German garrison, commanded by Governor Alfred Meyer-Waldeck, surrendered on November 7th, 1914, and its defenders were taken into custody as prisoners of war by Japan. Japan's alliance with Britain notwithstanding, its entry into the war was not a foregone conclusion, but rather a strategic choice to exploit an opportunity for further expansion into Asia. Regardless, the immediate reaction in Germany to Japan's entry into the war was a combination of indignation and rage. Kaiser Wilhelm II had staked his personal prestige on the successful defense of Tsingtao, having supposedly declared that, quote, "It would shame me more to surrender Tsingtao to the Japanese than Berlin to the Russians," end quote. Accordingly, during the first wartime assembly of the Reichstag, a letter memorializing the loss of Germany's model colony in China and addressed to Wilhelm on behalf of the assembled Reichstag members was read aloud. Quote, "The entire German people is deeply agitated and moved in response to the fall of Tsingtao, which, although courageously defended to the last moment, was forced to yield to superior numbers. A work of German labor, built by your Majesty with the people's joyous support as symbol and stronghold of German culture, fell victim to the envy and greed which have united our enemies," end quote. Echoing these sentiments, Johannes Kempf, speaking in his capacity as president of the Reichstag, declared that, quote, "Japan, whose ingratitude could only lead to the covetousness of the landmarks of German culture, which we erected in East Asia, has joined our enemies," end quote. Within the German press, a dramatic surge of viciously racist yellow peril rhetoric and imagery replaced the friendly, if condescending, representations of Japan, which had predated 1914. As one contemporary observer noted, German newspapers went overnight from referring to the Japanese as, quote unquote, "a refined yellow race" to "yellow stink apes" from one day to the next. German news media accused the Japanese of having betrayed the country that had played such a pivotal role in their modernization, claiming that their actions had constituted a fundamental breach of goodwill and trust between the two nations. It is impossible to ignore the crude and explicitly racialized form that this rhetoric took, anticipating the ugly rhetoric in interwar Germany responding to the presence of French colonial troops in the occupation of German territory. It is also significant that in both cases, it was non-Europeans who were the visible face of German decolonization, although the lessons that Germans took from these two encounters were very different. The approximately 4,700, just under 4,700 prisoners captured in China, which included around 300 men serving in the Austro-Hungarian armed forces, were transported to Japan during the fall and winter of 1914-1915 and interned in 12 temporary camps throughout central and southern Japan. So this includes all of the camps. The first list is the camps that were opened, and then you can see the later ones that are opened a bit later in the war. Some of these provisional camps were Japanese military installations, while others were Buddhist temples, repurposed to house the German POWs. Notably, several of these sites had been used to house POWs a decade earlier during the Russo-Japanese War. This layered history of internment can be seen, for example, at the Russian soldier cemetery in Matsuyama on Shikoku, where 98 Russian POWs are buried, along with a German serviceman, Arthur Lauenstein, who died in 1916, as well as 2 U.S. pilots who crashed in Matsuyama in the final days of the Second World War. These early camps were crowded. The POWs grumbled about the food and the regulations imposed on them by Japanese administrators, and there were reported incidents of corporal punishment and abuse by overzealous Japanese guards, but overall the conditions were judged to be adequate, both by the POWs themselves and by observers working with the Red Cross. Once it became clear that the war in Europe was not going to end as quickly as originally anticipated, many of the prisoners were relocated into permanent camps intended to be more comfortable. This also had the effect of defining the camps as clearly demarcated sites of internment, separated spatially and culturally from neighboring Japanese communities. As noted by Naoko Shimazu, this was a major departure from Japanese internment practices during the Russo-Japanese War, where Russian POWs were directly integrated into the local life of the communities in which they were housed. On the one hand, this spatial segregation of the German POWs resulted in fewer opportunities for sustained personal or sexually intimate relationships compared to the Russo-Japanese War. On the other, it allowed the prisoners some limited freedom in constructing and inhabiting the internal space of the camps as they wished. At the same time, the photographs taken by the POWs reflected ongoing curiosity and interest in Japan, the landscape, the people, and the culture. This was in marked contrast to the German domestic news media, which quickly lost interest in Japan as the target of its vitriol. It is certainly the case that Japan's relatively humane and generally respectful treatment of the POWs in its custody helped to facilitate the rapid rapprochement of Japan and Germany after the First World War, but just as important were the perspectives of the POWs themselves, as reflected in their photographs. The most well-known of the second-generation camps, that is the camps that were constructed during the war, was Bandō on the island of Shikoku, which is marked here on the map with the red dot. Bandō replaced the 3 smaller camps of Marugame, Tokushima, and Matsuyama. Located just north of Tokushima, outside the village of Naruto, Bandō was opened in April 1917, and prisoners were transferred from across the island, as well as a smaller contingent from the overcrowded camp at Kudame to this new purpose-built site. Bandō was one of the larger POW camps in Japan, with a population of just over 1,000 inhabitants at its largest. The camp's grounds, demarcated by a fenced enclosure, which measured about 57,000 square meters, included not just living quarters, but also 2 small lakes, one of which was used for boating, and 80 shops specializing in everything from bookbinding and baked goods to furniture construction and musical instrument repair. Just outside the camp, the prisoners also had access to a large sports complex, which included a soccer field, a turnhalle, and 8 tennis courts. Even at the time, prisoners referred to Bandō as, quote unquote, the best camp in the world. And both the camp and its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Toyohisa Matsue, are synonymous in contemporary popular memory in Japan with a humane and tolerant approach to internment, which facilitated not only a relatively pleasant experience for the prisoners themselves, but also a mutually beneficial dynamic of cultural and intellectual exchange between the German prisoners and their Japanese neighbors, especially after the 1918 armistice. Because of its status as a model camp, both the physical space of Bandō and the lives of its inhabitants were well documented at the time, both through official reports as well as artifacts produced within the camp. The Bandō-Sammlung, alongside the holdings of the Naruto German House, which is located on the former site of Bandō, is one of the larger archival collections associated with this camp. Acquired by the Deutsches Institut für Japanstudien in 1998 and expanded 2004 and 2005 via private donation I will discuss in greater detail below. The Bandō-Sammlung came to the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin in late 2021. The collection encompasses a wide range of materials beyond the photos I'm discussing today, including various publications printed in the camp's printing press, maps, theater and concert programs, and lecture notes. Its name notwithstanding, the Bandō-Sammlung also includes artifacts from some of the other POW camps in Japan. The photographic collection in particular includes items from Nagoya, Narashino, Oita, and Osaka, as well as Bandō's predecessor camps, Matsuyama and Marugame. One other thing to be aware of for anyone unfamiliar with this collection is that much of it can be accessed through a digitized website created and maintained by the Deutsches Institut für Japanstudien, which is a really wonderful resource for anyone who is interested in this topic. It is difficult to establish how many POWs in Bandō owned or had access to cameras. Although more affordable and accessible than they had been in previous decades, personal cameras were not yet as ubiquitous as they would become in the 1920s and 30s. But the camp did have at least 2 shops specializing in photographic services, quote unquote, of all sorts. These advertisements come from a guidebook to the camp and its facilities, compiled and printed in the summer of 1918, in anticipation of arrival of prisoners transferred from Kurame. So we see here 2 sort of rival shops specializing in photography services. It is likely that POWs also would have been able to purchase equipment and supplies through Japanese businesses. Amateur photography was becoming a hobby in Japan at this time. And we know that POWs who belonged to the various musical groups and ensembles in the different camps were also able to purchase or rent instruments, sheet music, and other equipment through similar means. In any event, there is a significant photographic record associated with life in Bandō, documenting the physical sites and landmarks within the camp as well as the local countryside. There are various people who lived and worked in the camp, and the events ranging from the mundane to the noteworthy with which they occupied their time. Given the limitations of time and to avoid excessive repetition, I have curated a selection of photos and offering my initial impressions in working with this archive. One of the immediate difficulties of amateur photography or amateur photos as historical sources is establishing authorship and context with any degree of accuracy or authority. Some of the photos in the Bandō-Sammlung have captions attached to them, and it is often possible to identify specific locations or individuals, but beyond that, the analysis of the images is necessarily speculative in assessing motivation or one image's relationship to others. Even with that caveat in mind, I believe that viewing the photos alongside each other as a collective project of both empirical documentation and historical narration can reveal common tropes, themes, and choices. So this first collection of photos all document noteworthy physical landmarks within Bandō. So we see the barracks, the front gate, the sporting complex with the tennis courts, and then also the musical pavilion, which was located on one of the lakes. Human figures are visible in them, but are incidental to the photo's composition and meaning. Rather, what is being communicated here are different visual representations of bounded space. The different buildings in these photos, which reflect the industry and ingenuity of the German POWs to make the best of their situation are visually demarcated as separate and distinct from their external surroundings through fences, walls, gates, etc. Moreover, there is a perceptible undercurrent of claustrophobia in all of these images, marking these islands of German culture as something that is being actively confined. By contrast, here are 4 images of the local Japanese landscape, landmarks taken by POW photographers. We can read in these images a fascination with traditional Japanese architecture and local customs. So we see here a few local buildings, as well as the image in the upper right, presumably pilgrims. Shikoku has a circuit of 88 temples that pilgrims visit. But the visual language of these photos, in contrast to the previous slide, is also worth examining. Whereas the perspective in 3 of those images is taken from above, looking down into the German space. Here, the viewer's eye is guided up and out. Despite the imposing architecture, there is not the same sense of confinement, but rather an invitation to move deeper into the image. So we see here this sort of visual language of inviting people to look deeper or to imagine the space outside of the image's frame. By far, the most popular subject of amateur photographers were their fellow prisoners. And of course, this is understandable for anybody who takes photos today. Some of these photographs were obviously of close friends or even solicited self-portraits, while others document the diversity of associational life within the camp. There are a lot of formal group portraits in the collection, and I will examine 2 examples in just a minute. But on this slide, I chose to highlight instead less formal, if not entirely candid, snapshots. These photos, incidentally, are not from Bandō, but instead from Narashino, which was opened in 1915 just outside of Tokyo. It is photos like this, I think, that speak most directly to the power of photography to manufacture and perform selfhood based on the subject's pose, surroundings, engagement with the camera, and emotional affect. We see here 3 very different visual strategies in capturing the mentality and subjectivity of the men being photographed, from the contemplative scene of a man with his clearly beloved dogs, and very cute dogs, I will add, as just a aside, to a jocular scene of amiable sociability that could just as easily have been taken in the German garden, to the literal performativity of the camp's orchestra. Japanese guards and administrative personnel are a less obvious, but never entirely invisible presence in these photos. There are some formal pose portraits of individual Japanese personnel, but I selected 3 photos here that offer more analytical substance in their ambiguity. These are the 2 images on the left, show Japanese guards alongside German POWs in visual compositions which can be interpreted as tweaking ever so slightly Japanese authority. So we see here the second in command of Bandō sitting in a friendly, sort of relaxed atmosphere with 2 Germans, and then below an excursion where you have the Japanese guards with guns, but the Germans don't appear to be particularly affected by their presence. The third, this is the image on the right, a striking snapshot of the Japanese guard shot in near silhouette, replicates the forced perspective of the Japanese landscape photos I mentioned earlier, as the eye is directed up and out. There are any number of different events and occasions captured by Bandō's amateur photographers, ranging from planned excursions to the beach and the local Awa Adori festival to theatrical performances and concerts. For the sake of time, I'm going to focus on the visual record of one particularly noteworthy event, namely Bandō's exhibition of visual arts and handicrafts, which ran from March 8th through 19th, 1918, with a reported total attendance of just over 50,000 visitors. Bandō's camp newspaper, Die Baraka, concluded that the exhibition had been a triumph of cultural diplomacy. So this is the quote that is on the slide, and I'm just going to read it. Quote, "Thousands of inhabitants of the country that hold us captive have admired the works of German POWs with their own eyes, and hundreds of thousands have heard about them through word of mouth and newspapers. To those who have been repeatedly exposed to the image of the German barbarian since the beginning of the war, we are able to show them with our exhibit, He gut Deutschland alle Weg. Hundreds of Reuters telegrams will not erase that impression. Thus, even with our modest resources, were we able to render a service to the fatherland, end quote. Photos of the exhibition, so this is one of them here on this slide, and I have another on the next one, reinforce the nationalist agenda of the event with the material evidence of German achievements in science, art, and culture, packed tightly together into the narrow space. So we see here all of these paintings and sketches, and then the bottom left image here shows another scene from within the exhibition where you have all of the items on display, tight or very sort of tightly crammed together. Even more interesting, however, are the photos taken of the Japanese visitors. In all three of these images, they occupy the center of the frame, often staring directly back into the camera, with POWs visible ever so barely in the background. So if you look hard, you can spot Germans in the background of all three of these images. Their presence in these photos serves as evidence of the innate appeal of German Kultur or German beer, even for provincial Japanese women and children. At the same time, the photographers demonstrate a curious or a reciprocal curiosity in them that is neither exoticizing nor condescending in its gaze. As I work to refine my initial impressions of this rich archival resource, I'm particularly struck by a few key themes that I hope to continue elaborating. The first is the significance of perspective in representing spaces that are culturally coded as German versus those associated with Japan. The second is the use of photography in both documenting and performing selfhood, as well as positioning the German self in relationship to the Japanese other. Finally, I'm interested in attempting to reconstruct some understanding as to how these photographic conventions evolve over time and space. Although this will require more work in actively putting these photos in conversation with other sources, and I'm thinking here of texts and ego documents. And as the final part of my presentation for today, I'd like to take some time to focus in on three particularly important artifacts associated with the Bandō-Sammlung. That is the albums donated by the Evert family. Photo albums have received increasing attention by historians over the last decade, partly because they seemingly offer solution to some of the methodological problems associated with individual photographs. Authorship is often easier to establish, as is the context in which photos were taken. Moreover, a photo album is more than just a collection of random photos. It is a carefully curated visual narrative of an individual's subjective experience. Commercially manufactured photo albums had been popular in Germany since the late 19th century as a means of collecting, sorting, and preserving visual keepsakes, initially carte de visite, and then increasingly personal photographs. There are any number of surviving personal photo albums dating from the First World War, assembled by soldiers, as well as auxiliary personnel like nurses, which have received attention by historians. These albums prominently feature formal studio portraits of their creators, as well as their fellow soldiers. As Justin Court observed in an article from 2017, scenes of violence are noticeably absent from these albums, and the battlefields and trenches, which define the contemporary iconography of the First World War in Europe, are depicted from a distance. Dead and mutilated bodies are invisible in these albums. Death is acknowledged in photos documenting the funeral processions and soldiers' graves. In most cases, each individual assembled one album encompassing their war experience. That album represents their attempt to make sense of the war and their position in it. It is therefore notable that the three photo albums in the Bandō-Sammlung were all assembled by the same person. They were donated in 2004-2005 by Rolf Evert as part of a larger collection of memorabilia previously owned by his great-uncle Rudolf. So here we see Rudolf in a number of images from his albums. Rudolf Evert, an employee of the Deutsch-Asiatischen Bank in Shanghai before the war, was taken prisoner at Tsingtao and initially interned at the camp at Marugame before being transferred to Bandō in April 1917. Released in 1919, he remained in Japan until the start of the Second World War, whereupon he returned to Germany and lived in Koblenz until his death in 1971. Evart's 3 photo albums, which document his life as a POW, principally in Marugame. There are fewer photos that can be identified as having been taken in Bandō, were carefully and thoughtfully assembled and thus offer a more sustained narrative with which to engage than a single loose photo. On the other hand, their composition subverts the possibility of a single clear-cut interpretation or narrative, because many of the photos appear in multiple albums, but in different contexts. In effect, the albums function as 3 versions of the same story. Of the 3 albums, the longest, entitled Tsingtao by Evert, was likely intended as a personal keepsake, judging by the inclusion of several formal portraits of military units and associational groups, all the men carefully identified by name. So these images, the Qingdao album is shown on the left. That the top image is the front cover, and then the image below is the front page. Notably, Evert did not identify himself in these photos for obvious reasons, but his name was carefully inserted at a later date by a different individual, perhaps Rolf. So you can see here the image on the upper right, where you have this formal portrait of men from Shanghai. Evert's name, I circled it, was added after the fact in a different handwriting to identify where he was in the photo. Tsingtao is also considerably longer than the other 2 albums, with 45 composed pages as opposed to 12, and includes 5 pages of photos documenting the graves of fallen German soldiers, most of them in Tsingtao, 1 in Marugame, and includes, and this is a subject that is almost completely absent from his other 2 albums. Indeed, this album strikes a decidedly different tone than the other 2. Evert does not indulge in the humorous captions that he frequently inserts in the other albums, but does include snapshots of the camp's musical ensemble, of which he was not a member, as well as photos of the temple complex and surrounding landscape. The overall effect is more functional than performative. Whereas the other 2 albums exist in a kind of atemporal or liminal space, Tsingtao is organized chronologically, beginning in China and then chronicling life in Marugame. Significantly, this is the only album to include dates other than in the title, and holidays demarcating the passage of time. Evert commemorates Christmas 1914 with a formal portrait of the camp's occupants, including 2 dogs, a Turnfest held in 1915, and then again Christmas in 1916. Despite being much shorter, the other 2 albums received significantly more evocative titles. So the first one, Stunden der Notvergiss, aber was sie deklären nie, Kriegsgefangenheit Marugame, 1914-1917. And then the second one, O Marugame, du Muren meiner Jugend, Kriegsgefangenheit, and continues on. So for simplicity's sake, in referring to these 2 other albums, I will refer to the former as Stunden and the latter as Marugame. These 2 albums are essentially variations of each other, aside from the duplicate photos, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. They were assembled in identical albums with similar compositional layouts and cheeky captions, suggesting that they were originally intended as gifts for family members or friends. So the images on the right of this slide, this is Marugame, so you can see the cover and then the first page. And the other album is basically identical to this. This conjecture is further supported by the inclusion in both albums of posed photos of Evert himself, one seated at a desk and the other casually standing outside, his pipe in one hand. So that is this photo here on the left. On the other hand, there are obvious differences between the 2 albums which need to be properly acknowledged. Whether these differences reflected the perceived preferences of their intended recipients, or Evert making different associations between images and their relationship to each other, cannot be definitively determined. Nevertheless, the tone of both albums is lighthearted and cheerful. Many POWs are shown engaged in various activities around the camp, although most are never identified by name. The album titles allude to the tedium of prolonged confinement. This reference here of Marugami as the Muren of his youth, or the listing of the years that he was confined in this camp. But there is no evidence of stress or discomfort within the photos themselves, with one exception I will address below. In short, if Tsingtao resembles a diary, the other albums are more reminiscent of contemporary social media. And yet the constituent elements of the three albums are more similar than they are different. In total, there are 8 photos which appear in all 3 of Evart's albums, with another 17 which appear in at least 2. The most frequent overlap is between Stunden and Marugame, the 2 shorter albums, but there are also images appearing in one of these shorter albums as well as Tsingtao. Evart clearly assigned special significance to the 8 images he chose to include in all 3 albums, which makes them convenient landmarks in comparing the 3 albums. We've encountered one of these landmark photos already, namely the photo of the mail delivery I discussed at the beginning of my talk. A grouping of 3 photos document the sleeping accommodations of the men housed Marugame at various times of day. So this is from Tsingtao. The first shows the empty sleeping quarters, emphasizing their crowdedness, even without the inhabitants, with furniture and clothing lines strung overhead. The second shows the men airing out their bedding by draping it over the temple railing. So that is the 2 images here. And then in the third, Evart had apparently recruited his compatriots to pose for the camera while reclining in bed during daylight hours, judging by the lighting. So we see here this sort of humorous, cheeky photo. I particularly like that man in the middle who's smiling for the camera. Viewed as a sequence, the 3 photos convey a clear narrative of mild inconvenience, resourcefulness, and cheerful good humor, and indeed that is how they appear in Tsingtao. In Marugame, on the other hand, Evart chose to emphasize the peacefulness of the empty sleeping quarters by linking it visually to a snapshot of sleeping puppies and a candid of men enjoying a sunny day in folding chairs. 2 other photos included in all 3 compositions are of the kitchen staff, and then also this photo here, the wash bank. In Marugame, the kitchen staff, or in Stunden, this is linked to the photo of cleaning or airing out the bedding. In Marugame, on the other hand, the photo of the kitchen staff is linked to other food-themed photos, which shows a pig apparently named Elvira being butchered, and then the third of men holding plates after having been served. And then the third photo, the wash bank, is associated instead with hygiene through its pairing with one of Evart's most striking and enigmatic photos from the camp's infirmary. The photo, alternatively titled Revierdienst in Krankenstube, depicts 3 Japanese medics distinguishable by their white coats in the center of the image, with at least 8 German POWs visible in the camp's middle and background. One is having his leg bandaged, and another has a bandage tied around his head. Because of the way the photo is lit, the stark white of the bandages in the medics' coats are what immediately register in the image, whereas the POWs recede into the dim interior of the infirmary. One of the medics studiously avoids looking at the camera, while another makes eye contact, as do several of the Germans. Whereas the photo of the mail delivery only implied a Japanese authority, this photo makes it explicitly, and yet at the same time, it complicates the status of the young medics through the physical presence of so many German observers. Whereas Evart's other landmark photos convey an atmosphere of nonchalance and purpose, there is an undercurrent of tension in this photo that makes it distinct. Whether he chose to include it as evidence that he and his fellow Germans were receiving proper medical care, or to highlight the incongruity of Japanese medical personnel having the literal power of life and death over German soldiers, is purely speculative. Either way, it invites closer scrutiny. And so, given the limitations of time, in lieu of a formal conclusion, I'd like to just offer some brief remarks. The image that I chose for this final slide shows 4 men studying the latest news from Europe via the daily telegram service operated within the camp. Hung next to these pages is a large map of Europe, a useful visual aid in making sense of locations and geographic features mentioned in these news dispatches. For those of you who are keeping count, this was the 8th photo that Avard included in all 3 of his albums, and it functions in my mind as a metaphor for the POWs' relationship to the First World War. They very much understood themselves as active participants in the global conflict, even if distance and the lack of ongoing military operations in Asia meant that their service was frequently overshadowed or obscured. The first POWs were released in April 1919 were Czechs and Slovaks, followed by other individuals who could claim citizenship in one of the East Central European successor states. Repatriations to Germany and Austria began in 1919, and then the final camps were closed in early 1920. Some former POWs chose to remain in Japan, others settled elsewhere in Asia. Despite the influence of a handful of former POWs in interwar German politics, the camps themselves quickly faded from local and historical memory. Interest in the site of the former Bandō camp was only revived in the 1960s, when the local press reported on the efforts of a couple, refugees from Japan's empire in Korea, to clean and maintain the memorial cenotaph built by the POWs. Much has been accomplished subsequently in rewriting Bandō, as well as several of the other camps, back into regional and local histories, as well as Japanese national history. And commemorative events celebrate the camps as sites of German-Japanese friendship. My project both builds and complicates that historical scholarship by historically contextualizing the POW camps in Japan during the First World War within several historiographic fields. Photographs are an integral part of that process, both in what they depict and in what they represent. The German and Austrian POWs may not be forgotten per se, but much more can still be done in integrating this history into our broader understanding of the First World War and its consequences. Thank you very much.